If you know the first half of this story, you already know the great trick of Vincent Price's life. The man whose voice was the very sound of fear was in private the gentlest soul in Hollywood, a lover of paintings, a gourmet in an apron, a man who wanted nothing more than to hand a little beauty to ordinary people. The monster was the mask. The kindness was the man. But kindness wasn't the only thing Vincent Price hid behind that velvet voice, because there was a second secret, a darker one. And this one he kept not just from his fans, but from the people closest to him, in one case, from his own daughter, for the rest of his life. It is the story of a man who found the courage to stand up on national radio against the hatred poisoning his country, at the exact moment when speaking your conscience could end your career. A man who was watched. A man whose name landed in the files of the most feared agency in America. And a man who, when the fear finally reached his own front door, did something quiet and frightened and very human. Something his family would only discover long after he was gone. The first half of his story showed you that Vincent Price was kind. This half will show you that he was brave and what that bravery nearly cost him. To understand it, we have to start with something uncomfortable. Because the great defender of tolerance did not begin his life as a tolerant man at all. To see how far Vincent Price traveled, you have to see where he started, and it is not a flattering place. As a young man fresh out of Yale and hungry to see the world, Price traveled through Germany and Austria in the years between the wars. It was the era of crumbling old empires of a Europe in upheaval, and according to his own daughter, in her later biography of him, the wealthy young American was at first swept up by some of what he saw. In those early years, she wrote plainly, her father held anti-Semitic views and even felt an initial admiration for the rising figure of Adolf Hitler. It is a hard thing to hear about a man so many people loved, but it matters because it is the beginning of a transformation, not the end of one. The young man who was briefly dazzled by that darkness lived to understand exactly what it became, and he spent the rest of his life on the other side of it. By the time he was a famous voice in American homes, Vincent Price had become one of the most outspoken enemies of prejudice in all of Hollywood. On July 30th, 1950, at the close of an episode of his hit radio series, The St. Price set the script aside and spoke directly to the country. He called racial and religious prejudice a poison. He warned that hatred between Americans only served the nation's enemies, that a country divided against itself by bigotry was a country handing a gift to those who wished it harm. It was a stunning thing for a popular entertainer to say out loud, and the timing could not have been more dangerous. Because that very summer, the machinery that would punish people exactly like him was roaring to life, and his conscience did not stop at race. Decades before it was safe or common, Vincent Price stood up for gay Americans too. When his daughter Victoria came out to him as a lesbian, he did not flinch. He embraced her, and he confided in her that his own private life had been more complicated than the world knew. He joined a national group supporting the families of gay people. He publicly condemned a famous anti-gay crusade in the 1970s, when most celebrities stayed silent. And he became one of the very first famous faces to film a message trying to calm America's fear of people with HIV and AIDS at a time when that illness was met with cruelty and panic. This was the real conscience hiding behind the horror. Not loud, not preachy, but fearless and decades ahead of its time. The trouble was in the country Vincent Price lived in. A conscience like that could get a man erased. To understand the danger he was in, you have to understand the fever that had gripped America. By the early 1950s, the country was in the grip of the Red Scare. The fear of hidden communists had become a kind of national panic. And in Hollywood, that panic had teeth. A pamphlet called Red Channels named entertainers suspected of left-wing ties, and once your name appeared on a list like that, the work simply stopped. Sponsors fled. Networks looked away. Careers built over decades vanished in a week, not because anyone proved a crime, but because someone somewhere whispered the word subversive. And Vincent Price was exactly the kind of man who made the watchers nervous. He was liberal. He was outspoken. Over the years, he had lent his name and his time to causes and organizations he believed in, some of which, it turned out, had quiet ties to the Communist Party that he later swore he never knew about. Then, around 1954, the blow landed. Price was appearing on a popular television quiz show, sponsored by a cigarette company. Without warning and without explanation, the sponsor dropped him. No reason was given, but Price understood. The whisper had reached him. He was being quietly pushed out, gray-listed, and he could see his entire livelihood beginning to slip away. So the man who had bravely condemned hatred on national radio did something that the brave version of himself would never have imagined. Frightened for his career, Vincent Price sat down and wrote a 5-page letter in secret to the FBI. In it, he laid out every political activity, every organization, every association of his life. He swore he had never spread communist ideas. He insisted he had joined those groups without any knowledge of what lay beneath them. And in his fear, he went further, writing words that the proud, principled Vincent Price of later years would surely have winced to read, even suggesting that those who hid behind their constitutional rights should be treated as a threat. That spring, he sat for an interview with the agency to clear his name and his wife's. And then he buried it all. Here is the part that breaks your heart a little. He told almost no one. After his death, when those files finally came to light, his own daughter said the family was stunned that he had ever written such a letter, because in public, for the rest of his life, Vincent Price spoke of those years with nothing but contempt for the people who informed on their friends and admiration for the ones brave enough to resist. He carried the gap between the man he wished he had been and the frightened man he was quietly, privately, until the day he died. The voice that taught a nation to fear had learned in the worst way exactly what fear could do to a person. If the country never saw his fear, it also never saw his heartbreak. And in the last chapter of his life, there was a great deal of it. For all his marriages and all his fame, the deepest love of Vincent Price's later years arrived fittingly on a horror film set. In 1973, while making a movie called Theatre of Blood, Price met an Australian actress named Coral Brown, sharp, glamorous, famously quick-witted, and cast of all things as one of his victims. They fell in love. They married the next year. He adored her so completely that he changed his own religion for her becoming a Catholic, while she became an American citizen for him. After a lifetime of playing at darkness, Vincent Price had found something bright and real, and then he had to watch it be taken away. Coral Brown was diagnosed with breast cancer, and her illness stretched on for years. Vincent Price, the elegant, witty, endlessly social man, spent those years as a quiet, devoted nurse to the woman he loved. He was at her side when she died in the spring of 1991. The loss hollowed him out. Friends said he was never quite the same again. He did not have long to grieve because his own body was failing too. A lifelong heavy smoker, Price was now battling emphysema, the lung disease that comes from a life of cigarettes, along with the slow, cruel tremors of Parkinson's. The illnesses stole his strength and his famous control. By 1989, he could no longer keep up the work he loved, and he stepped down from hosting the television mystery series that had introduced him to yet another generation. There was one last gift waiting for him, a final tender role in a film by a young director who loved him. But even that was a struggle. By then, he was so frail that his scenes had to be cut short, filmed in pieces, because the man who had once stood 6'4" and filled a screen with menace could barely stand for long at all. Through all of it, the grief, the tremors, the failing breath, he kept his suffering where he had always kept it, out of sight. The public still heard the velvet voice, still smiled at the charming old gentleman on their screens. They did not see what it was costing him to give it to them. Vincent Price died on October 25, 1993, at the age of 82. The lung cancer that his decades of smoking had promised finally arrived. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered into the Pacific off the California coast he loved. And so we come back to the question underneath both halves of his story. For half a century, an entire nation listened to that unmistakable voice and believed they knew exactly who Vincent Price was. The fiend, the ghoul, the elegant face of fear. They had no idea. They never heard the young man who had to grow out of his own prejudice the hard way, and who spent the rest of his life fighting the very hatred he had once admired. They never saw the entertainer brave enough to condemn bigotry on the radio when silence was so much safer. They never knew about the frightened letter to the FBI or the decades he carried that private shame. They never watched him nurse his dying wife or feel his own strength slip away or push through pain to give them one last gentle performance. The country heard only the voice. It never met the man. The first half of his story proved that Vincent Price was kind, that the monster loved beauty and art, and a good meal shared with friends. This half proves something harder and rarer, that he was brave, that he was flawed and frightened and human, and that he kept becoming a better man anyway. That behind the most famous voice of fear in America was someone who spent his life quietly trying to make the world a little less cruel, and who hid his own fear and grief so that the rest of us would never have to share it. That is the real Vincent Price, not the monster in the dungeon, not even just the gentleman in the apron. A man of genuine courage who carried his secrets and his sorrows alone and gave the world only his warmth. The face of fear was never who he was. It was only ever the costume worn by one of the bravest, kindest, most quietly human men Hollywood ever produced. If this story moved you, there are more like it. Waiting right here, the real lives hidden behind the faces that once filled America's living rooms. Subscribe, and we will keep telling the truths they never got to tell.